On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. When I was in 7th grade, my algebra teacher, Mr. Canty, countered the conventional wisdom that the day after Halloween is when the kids are kinetic because of all the candy. He said, negative. The day after Halloween, the kids are falling asleep. Well, it just happens that last night was the Night of the Saints at the Shrine of St. Anthony, where candy was given out at Stations of the Saints, and I noticed that our parish was disproportionately represented there. So I'm trusting you will make sure that your sugar crash does not happen until after the Mass is over. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. These words are familiar to all of us because it begins our Mass. As Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. We can't love your neighbor unless you are loving God. You cannot love God unless you are loving your neighbor. So these two commandments are inseparable from one another. I hope this is clear, and in fact, in Luke's gospel, this very passage Jesus uses to lead into the parable of the Good Samaritan, answering the question, who is my neighbor? Your neighbor is not just the person who happens to live next to you in this similar socio-economic situation. It is not somebody who shares your religion. What this parable shows us is that our neighbor is somebody who does not look like you, who does not smell like you, who does not share your values, and in fact, may very well be your ideological enemy. This is your neighbor who you are called to love, if you love God. Now, this is something that is not new that Jesus was introducing. This is something that is woven into the whole narrative of the Hebrew Scriptures. And we see this pointed to in Exodus 29, where Moses says, you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him. And what is the basis for this? He says, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And then he ends this passage with saying, for I am compassionate. These are the words of God. God is compassionate. So our love for God is to receive his compassion from above, vertically, and then to pass it on to others horizontally. He delivered us from our slavery, so we're compassionate to others who are also strangers wherever they may be. Love of God and love of neighbor together. Now, you might say this is simply the basis of true religion, and it is a religion based on relationship with God and with our neighbors. But yet, most religion throughout the world does not share this characteristic. And it makes sense if we even look at the root word for the word religion, which comes from the Latin religare, which means to bind together. And so isn't it true that when we're bound together in a certain kind of commonality, we find a certain kind of antipathy for those who are not bound with us? They are the other, just the other. And if you have a heartbeat, then when you are bound together with those of like mind, then you tend to regard them much higher than those who do not share your commonality. But the Scriptures are revolutionary in lifting us above that tendency. And it happens in the very beginning, where the Hebrew Scriptures tell us that all humanity is created in the image of God. This is revolutionary. And all the Scriptures, we have a thread throughout all of them, which is to remind us of this reality. Even though there is a covenant with all of humanity, as we see from the beginning of Noah, and then a particular covenant that God makes with his people. But yet we see throughout that all are, on a certain level, children of God. But yet, even in the early church, there were tendencies that militated against this. And we call this dualism, and which comes up because it's very hard, by the way, in a complex world to maintain a monotheistic perspective. Because after all, if we have light from above and we see darkness in the world, which certainly exists, we want to dissociate ourselves from that darkness, don't we? And so, but how do we do this if there's one God and somehow everybody is made in his image? And so in the Christian world, there was this heresy that came up from the Greeks, Gnosticism, the idea that we are the enlightened ones. And those who are so earthly, those who just seem to not have this truth, we want to separate ourselves from them. But St. Irenaeus in the 3rd century was very clear to say, this is a heresy. In fact, you might even say it's the heresy of heresies because it never goes away. We still see it in our world. We'll come back to that in a moment. But the idea is this, is that that's not consistent with the scriptures. After all, if you look throughout the whole biblical record, those who we admire in the scriptures, the heroes, all have shades of darkness in them. They're all deeply flawed characters. From Abraham to David, all the way through. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn was very clear, famously saying this simple truth, that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. We all have a measure of darkness in us, and we're all on a journey to embracing more light. So this dualism, this idea that there are children of light and that there are children of darkness in the world is not from God. But then what we have, even worse, is what Rabbi Jonathan Sacks calls a pathological dualism, where the locus of that evil is seen as in other people groups themselves, which rears its ugly head throughout all of human history. And in light of this, I'll come back to it in a moment, but Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote this book, Not in God's Name, which is people taking God's name in vain by bringing his name through this perspective. This was given to me by a parishioner a few months ago, and I'll come back to him in a moment. But first of all, let's just consider how this pathological dualism is rearing its ugly head today, and let's just be very blunt. It happens when we see it, we've seen it in the past few weeks, when radical jihadism, Islam, has been directed against the Jewish people. And I'm not saying against the nation of Israel. I'm saying against the Jewish people, which is nothing new. And so the stated intent is not just to do something about a state, but to eradicate the people. And Rabbi Sacks points out to us, I'm just going to have to scratch the surface of this. But in September 7th in 2014, former Jordanian MP Sheikh Abd al-Munim Abu Zant, broadcast on Al-Aqsa TV, said, "We have to understand the true nature of the Jews because the entire world is tormented by them. They allow cannibalism and the eating of human flesh." Said this on TV. Really? And the Egyptian cleric Mohammed Hussein Yaqub, broadcast on Al-Rama TV in January 2009, said, "If the Jews left Palestine to us, would we start loving them? Of course not. We will never love them. They are enemies, not because they occupied Palestine." This is pathological dualism. And let's consider some other places where we've seen this increasing in recent years. How about a movement that is in the name of inclusion and diversity, but those who are not enlightened by this ideology need to be canceled? And in fact, we see in California, they might be prisoned, in Canada as well. This is another example of pathological dualism. Now, let me just consider what is becoming more clear, what was a mystery to me about 20 years ago. I had a coworker when I was in seminary, and she was, even though a product of Western culture, had rejected all of its forms. She was a humanist, she was a naturalist, she was an anti-establishmentarian person, you might say, kind of thing, ex-hippie, okay, all right. But interestingly enough, she had this visceral affection for Islam, even though she didn't understand it very well, and this was immediately after 9/11. She spoke in wistful terms. And I thought, where is this coming from? After all, they're more hierarchical than the Western society that you're rejecting. But I've seen this come up over and over again. But we see this now. We see for lack of this is before we had these terms. She was basically woke before we had that term. But the woke revolution, for lack of better terminology, that we see today, has allied itself with the jihadists, with those who are targeting Israel over a common enemy. Now, we could say, Toto, we are not in Kansas anymore, because this is like upside down world. Even you have LGBTQ people who are also demonstrating in support of Hamas, but Hamas executes LGBTQ people. I'm getting the letters wrong. It should be longer than that. But this is incongruous. But they have a common enemy. Why is this? Well, you could say that you have this disconnect between loving God and loving neighbor. And whenever you get this balance off, you have upside down world. Now, you could say that those who were the perpetrators of the massacre on October 7th loved God, because after all, they said, Allahu Akbar, God is very great, while they murdered women and children. Greatest slaughter, one of the greatest slaughters of the modern world, most heinous. Are they loving God but not loving other? Or you have the woke movement, who seem to say that we love the other, but they don't want to have anything to do with God. Strange bedfellows, aren't they? But really, if you look at it, they neither love God nor love the other, because their focus is on victimizing the other. And if you do that, you're not loving God, because you're not looking up. The focus is pathologically, horizontally against the other. And Rabbi Sachs explains this dynamic fairly well. He puts it this way. He says, regarding this pathological state that we have, he says, defining yourself as a victim is a denial of what makes us human. And this is what they have in common. Hamas, the woke revolution, we are victims. That's our identity. We see ourselves, if we do this, as objects, not subjects. We become done to, not true doers. Blame bars the path to responsibility. The victim, ascribing his condition to others, becomes the cause of his situation outside of himself. So let's find a common enemy. This is not loving God or loving others. It is directing against the other. And so we might think that this is so apart from us, that we have nothing in common with them. But isn't it true that sometimes victims of persecution take on the qualities of their own persecutors? And let me just share an example of this. I had a professor in seminary, an evangelization professor, in fact, who was a missionary in France to the Muslim community. And he explained that he was in the marketplace and he was commending his faith to a Muslim. And he did it in such a way that mimicked the way the Muslims commended their faith to him, ending his commendation with a frown, saying, "That's why you need to believe in Jesus." And the Muslim man said to him very calmly, "If you really believed what you said, you wouldn't have to say it to me like that." Ouch. And he realized, well, here's essentially what this man was saying to the missionary. I already have dualism. I already have this mentality. If you really want to convert me, give me something more, will you? Don't you have something else to offer me? And don't think that you and I don't have a temptation to be the same way against those who are ideologically opposed to us. So what is the antidote? To look at the antidote, let's consider first the Hebrew Scriptures and then look at how this is also brought together through the life of Jesus. Now, in the Hebrew Scriptures, and Rabbi Jonathan Sacks points this out very well, not only were they strangers in the land of Egypt, but they understand that this whole world is not their home. In fact, David, at the very apex of Zion, when Jerusalem had been established, they were just about to lay the cornerstone for the temple. And what is his prayer, his public prayer? We are strangers and temporary residents in your sight, as well as our forefathers, is his prayer to God. And then Rabbi Sacks concludes, the people of the covenant will be strangers at home so that they are able to make strangers feel at home. Only thus can they defeat the most powerful of all drives to evil, the sense of being threatened by the other and not like me. And this thread, I wish I could take more time with this, but this thread is throughout all the Hebrew Scriptures that is illustrated in this one other paragraph from Rabbi Sacks. For though God is our God, he is also the God of all, accessible to all, the God who blesses Ishmael, who tells the children of Jacob not to hate the descendants of Esau, who listens to the prayers of strangers, and whose messengers appear as strangers. And so, likewise, basically, in the Hebrew Scriptures say you are not allowed to consider yourselves victims. You do not have a victim mentality. And in fact, in Leviticus 19, from where Jesus quotes, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," in the passage immediately preceding this, it says, "You shall not take vengeance." The only way you don't take vengeance on somebody horizontally is if you are able to look vertically. Love God so that you can love your neighbor. God is the one who will take care ultimately of these wrongs. And that does not mean, by the way, you can't defend yourself, but it means you don't take vengeance. And so likewise, Jesus loved the other. After all, his first message in synagogue was how those from other nations, Naaman the Syrian and others, came to Israel and received their faith. It was given to them as a gift to bring to their land. And then we have Jesus speaking to the woman at well, the abject sinner, the Samaritan woman, his ideological opponent. He spoke to her heart, and the Syrophoenician woman, whose faith he admired. But then Jesus as well, like the Jews, did not consider himself to have a home on earth. The Son of Man, he said to his followers, watch out, if you follow me, he has nowhere to lay his head, so will it be for you. And then when he was crucified, the writer to the Hebrews says he was crucified where? Outside the camp. And then he says, for we have another city that we look to, which is the New Jerusalem. And who crucified Jesus, by the way? Was it Caesar? Was it the Romans? Was it the religious leaders? It was you and me, as we say on Good Friday. I crucified you. Because as Solzhenitsyn said, The line between good and evil goes through every human heart. But our Lord Jesus Christ did not take on that victim mentality. No, he forgave you and me. He said, "Forgive them, for they do not know what they do." And it is from this perspective, this love of God that he had, looking up and calling upon his Lord in his darkest hour, that vertical love of God, that he was able to horizontally love others, and that is the essence of the cross. So that brings us to the continuity of the Scriptures. Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Love your neighbor, the other, as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets.